And this is discussing, it's in a really good article on 4 problems of assessment, or forgetting the title, but 4 points on assessment. And this is where he discusses how assessment should not be sorting or ranking. 4 purposes of assessment. That's the title. And he says approaching assessment from the perspective of sorting and or ranking is both internally and externally problematic. Internally, it presupposes that our assessment instruments are objective and infallible enough to accurately represent a student's attainment of curriculum goals within a single percentage point. I feel that in my bones. That's crazy. This is a ludicrous presupposition, as it ignores the inconsistency of not only the students, but also the teacher in representing and gauging such performance. This is a humbling statement for mathematics educators that are sorting or ranking, which is a broader term for different assessment practices that do this, like percentages do. Our first vignette showcased a student who came home with a grade of 75%, and they had a friend that was 1% higher. According to the percentage, the teacher could typically or theoretically rank one student ahead of the other. We shouldn't be doing that to begin with. And then on top of it, it's like, well, what makes them 1% better? We can't define each gradation. It's like he says, it's a ludicrous presupposition that we could assume that we can nail it within 1 percentage point. It's very unlikely that a student, teacher, or parent could explain why the friend ranked higher. And then the teacher probably couldn't explain why we're ranking students to begin with. But finally, ranking students based on ability is just antithetical to learning. And it increases a lack of clarity when it comes to assessment. You see, ranking and sorting students takes the focus off what students are learning, and it forces it all onto how many points they have earned or how much academic credit they have. I have a few questions per percentages, and then we'll take a break. First question is, how could we transform our thinking around assessment now that we recognize that percentages are not inherently objective? How could we think creatively? How could we embrace a functional form of subjective judgment when thinking about student learning? Tried to tap into that a little bit as we've discussed. And then how does professional judgment play a role when attempting to reflect on what a student has learned? So how could we think creatively? How could we find ways to use professional judgment? And then where would it fit best? In sum, I'll do in sum numerous times throughout these sessions, but this is also the part where it's like, your session was too long, I didn't listen. So here's in sum. The problem of percentages requires a solution of clarity. Objective assessment is a misconception, and therefore subjective judgment may prove more useful than teachers have previously perceived. I'll let those sit with you. Those are my 2 main points from this half of the session. And then as we take a break, I have some questions that you could discuss with the people around you, or just to peruse while you go and get a coffee or do whatever it is that you need, or pause the video. Is there a way that we can rethink assessment tools more clearly to explain what a student has achieved? How could we embrace a functional form of subjective judgment when assessing student learning? And have you interacted with assessment clarity and objectivity in your own practice? With that, let's take a break. All right, welcome back. Let's continue. I have 2 more problems of percentages and some more vignettes to tickle your brain or whatnot. That sounded weird. Whatever. Moving on. Okay, let's think. Here I have a student situation and a teacher response. So a student is told that they currently have an 85% in their mathematics class. They require an 86% to reach the next letter grade and be considered for a scholarship. This happens all the time in high school. Oh, I need an A to get into this school. Or if you're teaching IB, I need IB 7. Could you predict me a 7? And the teacher, in this situation, they're using percentages, and the teacher stands by their decision to currently award an 85% grade and suggests that the student completes additional assignments for extra credit. Remember, Many teachers think that percentages are inherently objective, so hence why this teacher would feel justified in standing by their decision. 85% is what you deserve. This is all of the numbers put together, and this is how it's going to stand. Now, assignments for additional credit is another typical practice, specifically when it comes to percentages also. We don't see it as much in other practices, but I'd like you to note that the teacher doesn't just want the student to show that they have mastered a skill or like to go back to a test that maybe they didn't do as well and show that skill that they didn't do so well on, that they can actually show them that they can do it, but to do something extra, to do more or something along those lines. So you need 1 more percent, extra credit for you. Here's a similar vignette on the flip side. A student is told that they currently have 48% in their math course and they require 50% to pass. Similarly, the teacher stands by their decision to award a 48% grade, and they suggest that the student completes additional assignments for extra credit. You know what? I have some empathy for these teachers because they believe that it's an objective grade. So why would they budge, right? Hey, I'm not like, it's not correct, but I don't blame them for thinking that if they've been fed the objectivity facade. So let's discuss margin for error. Earlier, we discussed that it seems rather arbitrary and subjective for a teacher to set their weighting system, and it's alarmingly subjective for an objective system. And it raises suspicion when a teacher puts their trust in a system and awards a grade that holds a student back from a certain category, which is also arbitrary, by one seemingly undefined percent. And I just want to let you know, I'm not always the fastest to critique systems. I'm faster to critique people than I am to critique systems. So just as an educator, it takes a lot for me to say, like, this system is flawed and it's arbitrary and not as objective as we would like it to be. But I can confidently say this. Just a side note there. But if this is the case, we can ask, whose fault is it that the student received an 85 instead of an 86? I would say the same goes for the student receiving a 48. Because what's the 2.2% difference? Like, might it be the fault of the system more than the student here? Blending and averaging aside, scholar Thomas Guskey has argued that increasing the levels of proficiency as high as 100 adds for a greater degree for error. We don't often think the Liljedahl quotation talked about, like, teachers are not infallible. They might be making mistakes. And Guskey says the likelihood of it is increasing based off of the amount of gradations. Let's read this quotation. So, in the absence of a truly accurate measuring device, which we don't have, we have to establish that our assessment methods aren't infallible. Adding more gradations to the measurement scale offers only the illusion of precision. That's crazy. That's quite something. Hey, that, like, it seems like, oh, it's very precise out of 100. You would be better off, like, cut it in half, cut it into 50, less margin for error, cut it into 10. I was talking to an MPED colleague who's an engineering instructor, and this institution needs to use percentages. I understand that not everyone can move away from percentages like that because you have institutional change that needs to happen. And that's where I'm like, okay, sometimes I'm living in ideals, which I don't always like, but whatever. They still needed to use percentages, but what they did is they broke all of the percentages down into groups of 10. So it was 0 to 10%, 11 to 20%, and so on and so on, and nine up to 90 to 100%. So instead of 100 gradations, they had 10. And what they did is they described each one. So a student that is in the 90 to 100% range does this, this, and this. And a student that is in the, I guess it would have been 91, but the 80 to 90% range or whatnot, it looks like this, this, and this. And they described each level, and that added clarity, and it shortened gradations so that there is less likelihood for error. I thought that was so smart. It was just a really previous questions were like, how can we think creatively? That's creative thinking. Okay, back to the script though. Okay. We've talked about margin for error. So, like, how precise are the tests that we're writing? And how confident are we? Like, are we humble enough to say they might be inaccurate? How might we think creatively to decrease gradations? And I'll talk about a 4-point scale in the last session, but I discuss, there are some people that are just deciding that even though they submit a mark that's 100 points, they're defining the 100-point scale in a different way. And I think that that's cool. So, and I think it's a very cool way of using functional subjective judgment. It's genius. So margin for error is a real thing. Moving on. The focus of percentages. I touched on this a little bit, but this is one that I think is just loud and clear and is more philosophical than it is about like objective assessment. But this is the last red flag that I'd like to raise on percentages. Percentages can be managed or manipulated. And in the last 2 vignettes, the teacher's response was extra credit. Let's just manipulate the percentage based off of extra assignments. And attempting to gain marks as opposed to demonstrate achievement takes the focus off of what is learned and on to what is earned. And learning is always greater than earning. This is just my thoughts. Like if I was in that situation as a teacher and they say, oh, like I have a low assessment on, or I'm looking to improve my assessment. First off, can I just say, like, not first off, I know there's some people that I'm going to be using language that people are saying, oh, you said this, or we don't talk like that. I'm not the language police. I'm more trying to communicate ideas rather than specific things. Like we'll talk about grade books later. I know people that call them learning target trackers instead of grade books. You understand what I mean with grade books, even though we're not necessarily moving towards grades. That's just an aside. Back to what I was thinking. If there's a student that needs to improve, I would let them improve. I wouldn't say do more. I would say go back to a target, or I'm showing my cards about learning targets. Go back to a goal that we set. Maybe it was about fraction operations. Go back and show me that you can solve problems with them. Let's find some. Let's find some problems to solve. And you show me that you can do a multi-step problem. Like, let's just try it again. It's not about adding more. It's about trying again and like actually showing that you've achieved proficiency, that you can do it, that you're competent enough. So percentages are just all about earning points. And that's a problem. Like even in the 3rd vignette, we got a taste of how percentages burn students who have learned plenty, but not attained enough points to achieve a certain letter grade. How is that fair? And in future sessions, I'll unpack how scholars like Katie White have rethought assessment in a way that focuses the focus is on driving learning forward, not just simply increasing percent totals. So here's a rhetorical question or so on the focus of percentages. How can assessment point the focus back to what is being learned? Instead of requiring students to achieve a certain amount of points, how can we encourage students to demonstrate a certain amount of learning? In sum, or too long, didn't listen. Percentages are meant to measure learning within a precise score of 100. They're meant to calculate a final grade out of 100 by amalgamating the previous learning experience scores and weighting them accordingly. Those are admirable things that they would like to do. The problem is that they don't always do that. And problematic assessment practices inhibit clarity, suppose pure objectivity, assume little margin for error, and remove the focus on learning. Those are the 2 things I really wanted us to learn today. Like, what are percentages? What are they trying to do? And then what constitutes a problematic practice? And do percentages align with that? I would also say, I know there's some people that are watching and they're like, oh, I use standards-based grading. Like, I don't use percentages. And I'm like, that's fantastic. But if in any way you are inhibiting clarity, supposing pure objectivity, assuming that there might not be margin for error, or removing the focus off of learning, that is also a problematic assessment practice. So this is a bit of a heart check for assessment. And percentages doesn't always pass. But I would also say the way that some people use standards-based doesn't always pass. But these are the 2 things I wanted to focus on: percentages and problematic assessment practices. Moving forward, or this is us putting one foot in the next session. We'll end with a moving forward every time. So, moving forward, how might we increase clarity? How might we embrace functional subjective judgment? How might we address potential error? How might we return the focus to learning? And how could we move forward from that fractions test? Remember the third vignette? Could we redeem that assessment? I think we can. And we're going to talk about that in the next session. So keep that. That's the one vignette to keep in your mind. The 15 out of 24 score, 0 out of 6 for dividing fractions. Is there a way that we could make it more clear what the student has learned on that assessment? And might subjective judgment help us or aid us on our quest? And how could we address potential error based off of the testing device? And then how could stakeholders walk away from the assessment knowing what a student has learned rather than what a student has scored? Your turn. At the end of each session, you'll want to refer to your handout. There's loads of questions for reflection, for discussion, and for enrichment. Reflection is for your own practice or just thinking about how this session has sat with you. Discussion is for you to comprehend what's been going on and discuss it with your colleagues. And enrichment is for those of you that feel like you got this and you're ready to move on, trying to apply what it is that we've learned today. All of those discussion points are in your handout with a number of other things. And you can also refer to the script or the notes if you need any other pointers. And last but not least, I have some suggested reading. These are my references if you're looking for more discussion of the problem of percentages and moving forward using alternative curriculum design and assessment practices in mathematics. So thank you very much, and I will see you in the second session.